Let's talk about the pros and cons of the 6 friction hitches I use most often in climbing applications. Hello again, I'm Jason. In many different videos, I've used various friction hitches, often selecting a specific hitch for a specific application. I thought I'd do a single video on the 6 friction hitches I use most, describing their pros and cons so that you can see why I might choose one hitch over another in a certain situation. Let's start with the hitch I use most frequently, the Autoblock. This isn't to say that I use it in the most applications, because I don't, but I use it for a circumstance that just happens to show up the most frequently. I use it as a backup for my rappel system. To tie the Autoblock, I simply clip one end of a closed loop to a locking carabiner, then wrap the double strand in the direction of the gate end of that carabiner. The number of wraps needed is dependent upon the thickness of the rope and the friction cord, as well as the cord's material. So I always test the hitch in both directions before I trust it. The upsides are that this may be the easiest friction hitch to tie of the set that I use, and for the purpose of a rappel backup, the fact that it is the least grabby of those hitches may also be a plus. The downside is that I need to be very careful about applying the right number of turns around the rope to find that sweet spot of having enough grab to actually catch in an emergency, but not so much as to make it hard to send rope through the rappel. Now, the first friction hitch I learned was the traditional 3-wrap Prusik. Here, we take the loop and run it through itself 3 times, making sure that each successive loop is filling in towards the middle of the hitch. We can add fewer or more wraps to reduce or enhance grab, but 3 wraps typically works with standard climbing cord diameters on most climbing rope diameters. This is pretty secure, and it is symmetrical, meaning it will grab when pulled in either direction. Those properties can be a benefit for things like rescue situations or glacier travel. For example, in some crevasse rescue situations, we may need to move up and down a rope frequently. But I find it annoying to tie and even more annoying to loosen, which is done by flipping the closing loop back from the hitch like a switch. After a shock load, that can actually be pretty hard to do, so I find the hitch to not be worth the trouble for situations like ascending the rope. Off of glaciers, though, I often turn to the Klemheist. I think I probably do this because I find it to be a very intuitive hitch to tie. To tie it, I start near the midpoint of my hitch loop, wrap away from my direction of pull, and then thread the pull end up through the small loop. This is not as easy to tie or loosen and slide as the Autoblock, but it is easier to tie and easier to loosen than a traditional Prusik knot. It is loosened similar to the Prusik by flipping the closing loop away from the hitch. However, it doesn't grab as well as the Prusik, and there is some debate over whether the hitch will grab in 2 directions. To pierce through this debate a little, I think we need to think about 2 different circumstances. In the first circumstance, I have simply tied the Klemheist upside down, so I wrap towards the direction of pull, leaving a small loop peeking out from the bottom, and then run the top tail through the bottom loop. This is actually a Hedden Hitch, and the Hedden Hitch will grab better, not worse, than a Klemheist. Here is a Hedden taking my weight. Here's a Klemheist made with the same cord on the same rope with the same number of wraps, and it will not hold my weight. But tying the hitch upside down is different than pulling the hitch in the opposite direction. In the former case, I have neatly dressed the knot. The closing loop is small and cannot easily unravel from the rope. But if I take a true Klemheist dressed with the top loop that is necessarily long enough to accommodate the downward pull of the loaded end, then that length is the amount of material that can unravel from the rope when I reverse the pull. Basically, a Hedden is well dressed, and a Klemheist pulled in the opposite direction becomes less well dressed. If we don't have enough wraps, that poorly dressed hitch can loosen. Since I tend to overwrap my hitches a bit, I've never seen it fail in practice, but we can see how it might with fewer wraps. All that being said, before I started using tib blocks and other tools for rope ascension, the Klemheist was my go-to ascending knot, as it opened well enough, but also bit well enough, and I didn't have to care if it was monodirectional or not because I was always going to be under it. There is one exception though. If I had to improvise a non-life-bearing foot Prusik with a piece of Dyneema cord. Here I would use the FB hitch, which is a Hedden hitch, but with an overhand tied in what would be the closing loop first. I get the extra bite of the Hedden and an easy-to-open hitch thanks to the overhand loop. Dyneema has a low melting point and is slippery, so already it is not the best material to use for any friction hitch. But if I was low on material and had to use it, being slippery material, I would have to do a lot of wraps that would make loosening the hitch really hard. Of course, This is a lot of knot to tie and eventually untie by comparison, so it isn't something I will use in normal circumstances. And speaking of a lot of knot, we come to the VT hitch. The upsides of the VT are that it is superior in its ability to bite and loosen. It's kind of magic that way, as normally the more bite, the harder it is to loosen, and vice versa. To tie the VT, we need an eye-to-eye cord. Then we wrap up the rope 4 times and make sure our eyes are roughly even. We take the top end strand and run it down and over the bottom end, and then add another complete turn around the rope. Then we take the bottom end and wrap it over the top strand turns. The fact that it takes an eye-to-eye loop is mostly a con. That's another piece of gear, isn't it? But it could be a pro in that we are going to have an easier time finding eye-to-eye cords that are fully rated to take falls. In certain rescue scenarios in vertical environments, that can be a big deal. Another downside is that the hitch takes up a lot of space once weighted, which may limit the space we have before running into other components of our system. That being said, I do carry an eye-to-eye for those rescue scenarios because I am often climbing with my kids and need to be prepared to not just get myself out of a jam, but get all 3 of us out of a jam, should it ever come to that. Which friction hitches do you use most? In what applications? Tell us in the comments. Thanks for watching this video. Please like, subscribe, and share if you want to support us. For more information, you can go to our website at www.shortguysbetaworks.com. You can check out one of those videos with one of these hitches talking about a rescue scenario where we needed to send a weighted rope. Or if you want to get into knots more specifically, you can check out our knots series. We'll see you next week and keep on getting more out of that big outside.